All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Wednesday. Good morning to my European friends. Happy independence of restoration of Independence Day again to Lithuania, which celebrated yesterday, 11th of March, 2025, 35 years after being the first ones out of the evil empire that is the Soviet Union. And we're still dealing with these tyrannical maniacs today in the East, Ukrainians on the front lines. Want to do a little bit more macro. Again, I'm a big believer in watch what they do, not necessarily what they say. We have a ceasefire proposal from Ukraine yesterday to see how Russia will respond. I would say that's a win for Ukraine and a win for the Trump administration. But we're going to have to see. The United States is obviously signaling, of course, that they want to do a deal. Question is, are they going to... How is the United States going to benefit if a deal helps Ukraine versus if a deal helps Russia? The United States certainly is going to position themselves in a way, I should say the Trump administration is going to try to position themselves in a way that works in either scenario. All right, a deal that could benefit Ukraine more versus a deal that benefits Russia more. And we're just going to have to wait and see how Russia responds, and in general, how Russia would respond to a 30-day ceasefire, because as Lech Walesa said, has remained true for centuries. Russians have one hand on the pen, the other on a grenade, always. They really don't like to deal when they feel that someone on the outside is setting something up. They'll just keep fighting or break the agreement. So I want to show you a couple macro pictures here. First one I talked about in the last stream. I just want to show it again because I don't think I made this point last time. We've got Western aid to Ukraine. Again, Europe has always been ahead. Finally, and thanks to the Trump administration's chaos, you can call it 4D chess, whatever you want to call it, Europe is getting out of mom's basement and understanding that in the fight for freedom and Western values, they're going to have to contribute more to their own security. And I'm going to show you charts about that today. But here again, let's just look at Western aid. It still is true, no matter the bluster that you hear from anyone's mouth in the United States, that Europe has provided more total aid to Ukraine the whole way through. Okay, I've stopped this here. You see these lines stopped at the end of 2024. This quarter I have not updated, but again, Europe is going to be ahead, even well ahead of the U.S. once this quarter finishes. Now, if you look at this figure, this is aid per casualty. Remember, there's about almost 900,000 casualties as estimated by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine that have been dealt by Ukraine to Russia. Okay, and you see that in the early days of the war, when Ukraine did not have a lot of Western aid and they didn't have as many cumulative casualties as they have now, this number almost hit €1 million per soldier. But of course, as the war has gone on, Ukraine has entrenched, Russia has entrenched, Ukraine has gotten more efficient. I know that's a morbid way to describe this, but one country is invading, the other is defending. So as far as Russian losses, Ukraine is heroically fighting and they're getting more efficient on the battlefield. And I should really stop it, here. You can see that it's going down. If aid stopped in the end of 2024 at the current numbers, they would get even more efficient, down to under 300,000. At the moment, it's about 300,000, 310,000 per soldier. So again, 70% better than it was at the start of the war in mid-2022. And Ukraine was making great gains here, by the way, taking back lots of land. But one thing I didn't make clear in the last stream was think about this number and then think about the headlines that you've seen from Russia throughout this war. They haven't done a full nationwide fascistic Nazi mobilization. Putin hasn't fully turned his Moscow elite and middle class, which is the only middle class in Russia, lives in Moscow, hasn't fully turned them fascist yet. He hasn't fully gone on to the crazy mode of just trying to Nazi Germany style mobilize every single boy into the army. There have been numbers that have been thrown out per soldier that Russia is being willing to pay. So again, what I'm showing you here is the Ukrainian cost in terms of Western aid in dealing blows, dealing casualties to the invader. All right, at the moment, it's about 300,000 euros. What throughout this whole war have we seen or heard from the Russian side? And that number is about 6 times less. Okay, you've heard, I'll just give you the dollar or euro terms. You've heard something like $40,000 salaries, $50,000 salaries. Sometimes they say bonuses. Of course, you know, Russia doesn't pay. They're never good on their word. But something like a cost, a direct cost, and again, Russia uses just old kit still. They're very, very inefficient still at developing new kit, although they are improving. They are very much improving. Still only costs Russia about 50,000 per soldier to hurl them at the front line. And that's a win for those poor Russians. Again, 1 in 5 Russians don't have a toilet. They don't have any liberal democracy there. They have no rule of law. They have no free press. They have nothing. Russia is a disaster, which, again, Trump is trying to bring them back into the fold. Let's not talk about what they say in this video. Let's just talk about what's happening. It costs Ukraine in terms of Western aid. Of course, it costs them more because, you know, you have other costs in the army. Well, I shouldn't say that. Let's just assume that Western aid is all that Ukraine gets. Okay, they still do have an economy and they produce and so on and so forth. But let's just assume that Western aid is the only money that Ukraine gets to finance its army. 300,000 euros per casualty. All right. So there's a big delta as far as what Ukraine, the cost for Ukraine to defend against a Russian soldier versus the cost per Russia to attack. 300,000 for Ukraine to defend versus 50,000, 60,000, whatever might be to attack from Russia's side. So that delta is pretty large. And to me, again, I'm just looking at the numbers. I don't know. I have no inside information. I would say if you look at that, probabilistically, if we assume that, you know, these are still 2 different armies, 2 different costs that I just described. One is on the attack, one is defending. There's a big delta there. And no matter what happens with this 30-day ceasefire, if Russia agrees, it seems Russia has the ability, I don't want to say will, because it's a tyrannical country and they're slaves invading free people, but they have the ability to keep throwing the meat assaults into Ukraine. Because, again, 300,000 to defend, 50,000 to attack, you can see that there's a delta. So I didn't quite make that point clear in the last stream. I just want to make it clear. That's the delta. That's what's actually happening. And again, that 900,000, which goes into this number of aid per casualty, that 900,000 soldiers as of this point, almost 885,000, whatever it is, as of today, March 12th. That's total casualties. So killed in action, wounded in action, missing in action, captured. That's the estimate from Ukraine. You can argue with that, but that's the stats that we have. So there's a delta there. Now, what I want to show for the rest of the video, as I talked about, is let's go back to the macro picture and more look at what they're actually spending on. Okay. So give me a second here. I'm going to pull up the other screen. There we go. This is a wild chart, in my opinion. This one surprised me. Okay, this doesn't have to do with military spend. This is just straight up government spend. Okay, so I'm going to bring in NATO. I'm going to bring in the United States. Going to bring in Iran, India, China, and Russia. It's a straight up chart here. Look at this. Government spend of non-US NATO countries. That basically means Europe and Canada. Government spend in 1990 was 70%, 69% in favor of Europe, of non-US NATO. This is an incredible number. All right, the United States, that means the expenditure side, basically the budget. They never hit the budget. They're always over, except for a couple years during the Clinton years. This is the actual expenditures. All right, so it includes the deficit. It includes the minus that they can't cover with taxes. All right, you spend $1. Sorry, you tax everybody at $1, but you spend $1.10. This is the $1.10. This is the basket that we're talking about. Look at 1990, how large a share of government spend Europe was. They really did have the capacity to spend on the welfare state. And Europe, of course, has a lot of problems with wars over the centuries. So they've decided, and when I say they've decided, this is they like 50, 60, 70 years ago, they've decided to really enhance regulations, do peace projects, do all sorts of regulations to bring the community together and understand that never again would happen. Now everybody knows that's really hanging in the balance here. But look, $3.4 trillion. That's what Europe was spending by governments in 1990. The United States, only 1.2 trillion. All right. This is a percentage of 100. Okay. So as we grow here, let's actually just take off all the others. Just look at Europe versus the United States. Now it's 73% in favor of Europe. It's about equal now, almost 50-50. But Europe still spends a little bit more. Okay, $12.8 trillion. And of course, this is these numbers are from the IMF and World Bank, by the way. So $12.8 trillion is estimated by Europe this year, and 11.3 to the United States. This could change. Obviously, things are very much in flux in the United States theater right now with tariff threats and cutting government spending, which is a good thing. And American people are behind cutting government spending. The question is just how you do it. Of course, we'll see. But Europe has always been a massive socialist project. Lots of government spend. See, the United States really upped this here after 9/11 .com crash. Okay, they went from 1.8 trillion to 3.4 trillion. A lot of that was military, but not all. And this is how it looks. This is how it looks. So it's about 50-50 now, but still, Europe, which is in mom's basement as far as military goes, is a way bigger spender on its economies from the government's perspective than the United States. Now look at China. Here's a threat. Here's a threat rising from the east. Whatever you think about government spending, war, printing money, Bitcoin, none of these are oil tanker, aircraft carrier type trends I'm showing you. Okay. I know that the United States is slashing a lot of needless spending, I would agree. Certainly controversial spending. Other governments still spend. And if there's a vacuum, and if other governments can still spend, they're going to spend. If there's a security vacuum, a power vacuum, that's the one thing that the White House cannot control. All right, so here's a threat from the east. China's now half of both the United States and Europe. If you put the United States and Europe together, you're at, $23 trillion. But look at that, 6.666. 6.6 trillion, 6.67 trillion from China estimated this year. Okay. The rest are quite small. All right. Let's put up Iran. Doesn't move the chart. Let's put up India. Slightly moves the chart. The number for India, 1.2 2 trillion. That's a lot, but India is a huge country. Ukraine's barely going to move the chart, and then Russia. Okay, and this, as you can see here in 2022, there's a bump for Russia. Let me take off now China, India, and Iran. We're just looking at, again, this sort of transatlantic theater where all the drama is in the war. Russia, $800 billion. The government is projected to spend this year. Ukraine, $100 billion. Okay, so from the government's perspective, Russia still remains 8 times larger. And Russia still to this day only controls a little bit less than 20% of Ukrainian territory. The United States and non-United States NATO countries, just enormous still. Absolute juggernaut compared to Russia. My question will always remain, why hasn't Europe done more sooner? And why can't Europe do more now to help Ukraine? All right. Now I want to show you. So this is government spend. I have to say, this one surprised me, this chart. Okay, when you look at it as a pie chart or a moving pie chart as a sort of a stacked 100% scenario, even though the United States is almost to the top, and they're not actually, still Europe and Canada together spend more, how much Europe spend relative to the pie, how much they spent in 1990 was really incredible. Let's look at GDP. All right, so similar metric, but it swings a lot more here. We see the power of the United States. They still were smaller than Europe in 1990. Still were smaller. 6 trillion versus 8 trillion, respectively. Okay, so Europe and Canada together, this is non-US NATO, is this bucket. $8.2 trillion economy size. That means 8.2 trillion in new goods and services a year. United States, 6 trillion. Then when you see here that the dark purple, the United States in this color map is higher, that means it's a bigger economy than Europe. It's switched back and forth here in GDP a few times, and then from 2019 only, the United States became clearly bigger than non-U.S. NATO, to where the United States is about at $30 trillion projected this year. Again, we're going to see how that changes in the next updates from the IMF. 27 trillion for non-U.S. NATO. But China, again, threat from the East rising. China's a huge economy now, 19.5 trillion. Okay, so when you put the U.S. and other NATO countries together, think about that, it's still huge. It's 36% of the pie plus 32% of the pie. 68% of the pie still is the free world, so-called free world. 23% China. That means China's still 3 times smaller, but China's clearly growing. They're not going to stop. They're not going to stop. Doesn't matter what Trump says, does, any deals that he makes. They're not going to stop. But look at Russia. All right. Smaller than India as far as economic output. India's $4 trillion. Russia's half that, too. And Europe, with the huge economy that it has, even if it's very socialized, and I'm going to show you a proportion in the next slide, Europe is still in mom's basement and cannot fully take on the necessary burden of protecting its European border from maniacal dictatorial aggressors. And by the way, the fact that some European colleagues in all random countries, I'm actually not pointing anybody out here, the fact that some European colleagues have mentioned that maybe China should come in for peacekeeping. If Europe allows that, Europe proper allows that, they should just pack up and go home. Look at how big of an economy Europe has compared to China. And you're going to say that you're not prepared, Europe, to defend your own borders? This is really unbelievable. Really stuck in mom's basement kind of behavior. All right, Iran. Again, Iran is such a big thorn in the side for everybody. 60, 70 million people in Iran. We'll check that in a second. No human rights there. A theocracy. Terrible place for most people to live. Economically, they're not even on this chart. Okay, they round to the nearest $500 billion, and Ukraine is under them. Ukraine, $200 billion economy, 10 times smaller than Russia, still bravely defending their borders to the extent they can. 20% of the Ukrainian border is still under Ukrainian control at 1/10 the economic size of Russia. So a Herculean, Churchillian effort from the Ukrainians. Europe slowly waking up, but waking up takes a lot of time too. All right, now let's put these together. I just showed you. Actually, not. Let's look at per capita just for a second, and then I'll go to military spend. So here's GDP per capita. More examples. United States, flying. I know that government printing has a lot to do with this as well. I'm not saying the United States is the best. It's not the highest number, by the way. You know, the smaller states that are rich, Norway, Luxembourg, Switzerland, they're all higher here. 90 grand is the estimated GDP per capita in the United States. That might go down depending on how the tariffs work out this year. But quite an increase from 2020. So government spending certainly has a part of this, as does money printing. Europe kind of left in the dust in this perspective, all right, per capita, only half the United States. But again, Russia, China, 15 grand. Again, remember, GDP, it's simply economic output on a one-year basis. Okay, so those 20, $30 trillion economies that I showed you in the last slide, you divide that per capita to get a sort of more comparable picture rather than just looking at gross figures. Russia and China way down, and Ukraine, of course, one of the smallest GDP capitas in Europe. This is what they're fighting for. They're fighting to move toward Europe. This has been happening now for 11 years, since the Maidan Revolution. They're fighting to get into the level of places like where I am in the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. We were illegally part of the Soviet Union for 50 years, and we broke out of that as fast as we could. We had prior constitutions, free times, pre-World War II to go back to. Ukraine, unfortunately, didn't have that, although they certainly have a rich and separate history from Russia. This is what they're fighting for. And Iran, India really looks low here, and it shows the wild disparity in the world, really. Golden billion is certainly up here, and I'll show that more in a second. Okay, now let's go to military spend. All right, military spend. This is interesting. This one only goes to 2023 because I'm using the SIPRI data, Stockholm Institute for Peace. Here we can see that the United States has always dominated. There's 1990. United States was here the majority for sure of the pie, nearly 60%, 57%. $325 billion in 1990. NATO, non-U.S. NATO, $200 billion, so behind, very different than the general government spend pie. And then all the rest basically rounding, to zero relatively, okay? See the threat from the east rising, China here, of course. But if we look at 2023, and these are going to change drastically in the last 2 years, okay? And this is unfortunately a slower. I'll try to get more updated numbers here, but I'm just keeping the same data set for now. China's is probably way higher than, not probably, it definitely is, probably close to $500 billion, all right? Russia, the same. Russia hides a lot of their military defense numbers in other government ministries. It's not so clear cut, but for sure, Russia and China are continuing their war economy. Europe, as of this time, year end 2023, we in the Baltics were screaming, Europe was still stuck in mom's basement, thinking that just the Ukrainians were going to stop this Russian threat on their own, fighting for values of freedom and private property, which Russia has none. There's no courts that are independent in Russia. This was a really bad time. Really bad time. Okay, look at Ukraine on this chart, 65 billion. That's a huge increase. You can see. Let's take off everything else but Ukraine, actually, just so you see. I guess I got to show a relative. You see Ukraine, even relative to Russia, huge jump from 2021 to 2023. All right. Ukraine was, 5% of the pie, and all of a sudden they roll to 37% of the pie, just looking at Russia and Ukraine. But both nations, to be sure, are spending way more. Europe is still asleep. China's spending, and then India and Iran, again, still pretty small, okay, for all that we hear about Iran. But look, Shahed drones, Russia is sending, they've been sending 100 to 200 Shahed drones a night into Ukraine. The Ukrainian air defense shoots down the majority of that. Again, U.S. aid has been paused. Now, apparently, it's back on with this ceasefire proposal. Let's see. Although I should point out, it's been reported that the pause on intel and some aid happened even before the Zelensky-Trump meeting in the White House. So that's something to keep in mind. Nonetheless, if you look at these charts, oil tanker-like charts, okay, one really wonders how it's even possible that Europe let this happen again. Look at how massive the U.S. and non-NATO U.S. countries are as a percentage of this pie. 48% plus 23%, all right, by my count, that's about 70%. $7 in $10 spent in military, and basically, the competitive northern hemisphere has been spent by the United States and non-U.S. NATO members. Still, Ukrainians pay, Ukrainians are suffering, and they're bravely fighting for values of freedom. And Europe is slowly waking up. Okay, so now let's see. I showed you GDP per capita. Let's go now and look at military spending per GDP. Okay, this is an interesting one. I'm going to have to take off, again, some of the other smaller, or not smaller, I should say, but different outside of the European theater. Here we see just obviously a huge jump for Ukraine. Let me take Ukraine off just so you can see what's kind of normally happening. All right. 2 to 3. This is this NATO recommendation of 2% per GDP. See, the United States has always been above that. Okay. And this has nothing to do with NATO dues or paying something into NATO. It has nothing to do with that. This is just a recommendation of your military spend per your economic output. Okay, during the Cold War, these numbers were up to 10%, 50% during World War II. Question is are they going to have to go there again? United States has always been around 5%, always well more than non-U.S. Europe, which has creeped well under 2% blended. Here we are at 1.5% in 2013. Now, to be fair, the financial crisis really did this, but even before the financial crisis, it was low. Bob Kagan, who is a neocon, I have mixed views on him, but he does have some interesting books. He wrote a book in 2003. I'd recommend it. It's called Of Paradise and Power, I believe is the name. Talks about how basically Europe was living in some sort of a postmodern paradise where they could really just continue to spend money on their economies because they had this shelter, this roof of protection from the United States world order. And of course, what was happening during this time, this was the Iraq-Afghanistan wars. You can see United States spending goes from, a low of 3% up to 5%. All right. So as the United States was ramping up, some European countries were helping. Actually, lots of European countries were helping, but on a per capita basis, sending soldiers, sending equipment to the theaters of Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States was running the show. Europe wasn't doing much. I'm not at all saying Europe. I'm not at all trying to say that the people that did go from Europe, and there were some 50 countries, as we saw the terrible quotes from Vice President Vance, which he makes a lot of terrible quotes, talking about how some random, country, how could a random country get in and protect Ukraine? Better to have a U.S. mineral deal, of course, without security guarantees, which we know what that means, like Budapest Memorandum all over again. You give up your nukes, this is what happens. I'm not at all criticizing the soldiers. And this was always, remember, this was a huge debate 15, 20 years ago, is don't criticize the soldiers. No one wants to criticize the soldiers. This is a question about decisions, manpower, resources. A lot of resources went into Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan, as we know, is basically a failed endeavor after 20 years. The Taliban came back in, just like the Soviets failed for 10 years. The United States has to one-up the Soviets and fail for 20. Iraq is still tenuous, but, it's not total. What's the word you want to use? Violent, militant, Islamic at this point. But the United States put a lot of resources into Iraq. Look at what Europe was doing. On the whole, not really. I'm not saying anything about the troops. Absolutely respect the troops that went and fought from all European countries. But relative to the United States, there's not much. What you don't see, and I probably should split out the post-1999 NATO members versus the pre-1999 NATO members, i.e. Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, i.e., as Donald Rumsfeld politically put it, New Europe versus Old Europe. New Europe, indeed, spent over 2%. Okay, not always, and especially during this period of the global financial crisis, I believe it was under, but certainly from 2014, when Ukraine got invaded the first time, New Europe has always been spending over 2% and well more than Old Europe. Here's 2023. You see a little bit of a tick up on all of Europe, all non-U.S. NATO, which again includes Canada and Turkey, not a European Union member. It's only 2023. This is going to go higher. And by the way, 2% is done. Okay, 2% is just done. Now it's 3%, 4%, 5%. Question is, is it going to be enough against Russian tyranny? That's the question. Okay, because Russia, this is only of 2023. You see what they've been doing. All right. Obviously, they've invaded Ukraine from this year, 2014, 4% and above, basically. Surprisingly low here for 2021. And they hide their numbers. They're spending more than what they say. Now, let's look at Ukraine. Let's put Ukraine in. Of course, Ukraine just changes the picture entirely. Ukraine was spending 4 or 5% since the war started there, which was well over, they were like the 2% levels. Actually, over 2% post-invasion. But of course, a lot of other things were happening here. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. Russia invaded Chechnya in 1999. And there's always, twice actually, mid-1990s and 1999. Russia's always an aggressive nation. And you see what Ukraine's had to do. So this is going to be even higher. 36% of the economy is spent on the military. This is even going to be higher in the last 2 years as this plays out. And I'll try to get better current numbers, but these are aircraft carrier type figures. They move slowly unless absolutely they have to. And here you see in Ukraine, absolutely they had to, from the full scale, just become completely militarized their economy. And these aren't going to change anytime soon. Let's look at population to close it out. I think this is mostly what I wanted to show today. Obviously, India and China, biggest countries in the world. India overtook China since 2022. 35% of the pie, 1.45 billion people in India, 1.4 billion people in China. There's a big margin of error there. Who knows if that's actually, completely accurate. Those are the estimates of 2025. This is let's take off now China and India. This is where I think, again, this should just be drilled home. And what Donald Tusk said after the special meeting in Ukraine, or special meeting in London about Ukraine, all right, a couple weeks ago, week and a half ago, he said a very important fact is that why is Europe, okay, and he said 500 million, but look, this is non-US NATO, okay, we got Turkey in there, we got Hungary in there, which really is not helpful. We got Canada in there, but his 500 million figure is actually low. He said, why are 500 million Europeans relying on 300 million Americans to protect themselves from 140 million Russians? It's a very good point. Eastern Europe has been complaining about this for a decade loudly, all right, since the 2014 invasion. But the Baltics have always been complaining about it, always been warning about it, certainly since the Nord Stream pipeline began. 140 million Russians terrorizing, subjugating Ukrainians to their dark ways, raping, pillaging, murdering. Hundreds of thousands of war crimes have been documented by Ukraine. And Europe is still in this sort of land of paradise and power. The United States is the power. Europe is just, they thought they were beyond it. We talk about peace and love and unicorns. Ukraine is heroically defending their freedom. And I just want to reiterate to anybody that thinks, regardless of if the ceasefire holds, and as I said, if we go back to this chart, here, I have lots of doubts about if the ceasefire will hold, because the cost to defend is high for Ukraine, but the cost to attack seems low for Russia. All right, I'm just putting salaries in for Russia. I don't know the Russian militaries. Actually, I do know the budget, but I guess I could put that in as well. But if we just talk about salaries and assume that they're taking out old Soviet tanks, which they are, and they're almost done with those, by the way. Some 10,000 tanks have been destroyed. Still, even though Russia needs a regroup, all right, it only costs them 50, 60,000 per soldier to attack, to run a meat wave. Whereas Ukraine, it costs 300,000 to defend. So there is a delta there. So if you had to ask me, I don't know, if you had to ask me the probability of, even if Russia agrees to this ceasefire, the probability that they will continue the attack remains higher. I'd say above 50%. But we're going to have to see how the ceasefire works. If the ceasefire works, if Russia agrees. And I would just remind everybody at the end of the day what Lech Walesa said. One hand on the pen, one hand on a hand grenade. That's how Russia signs deals. They're fighting for dictators. That's what they're fighting for. Ukrainians are fighting for freedom. I hope that people continue to remember that. And that's all I have for this video. So thank you for watching. Slava Ukraine.